When my daughter got married, I hid the fact that I inherited $9 million from her grandfather. Thank God I didn't say anything, because after the wedding, her husband showed up with a notary. I'm 61 years old. I live outside a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania, and until a few months ago, I was just a retired shop teacher who spent his mornings fixing up an old truck in the garage. Nobody looked twice at me at the hardware store. Nobody knew what was sitting quietly in a bank account with my name on it, and that's exactly how I wanted to keep it. My father built a steel supply business from nothing back in the 1970s. By the time I was in high school, he had trucks running all over western Pennsylvania and a house on a hill that looked down over the rest of us. He wanted me to take over the business someday. I wanted to teach kids how to use a table saw and read a blueprint. He never forgave me for that. We had one bad argument about it when I was 24, and after that we just drifted. Christmas cards, a phone call twice a year, nothing more. I got married, had my daughter, built a quiet, normal life on a teacher's salary, and my father built his empire 2 hours away without me in it. He never met my daughter more than a handful of times. He sent a check on her birthday every year and nothing else. I used to tell myself I didn't care. That was a lie I got good at telling. Then one Tuesday morning in March, I got a call from a law office downtown. My father had passed away in his sleep at 84. Heart gave out. No warning, no pain, according to the doctor. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone for a long time after the call ended, not sure what I was supposed to feel about a man I barely knew anymore. Sadness came eventually, but so did something else. A strange, heavy curiosity about what would happen next. I didn't know yet that it would change everything. The reading of the will happened 8 days later, in a small office with dark wood paneling and a lawyer who had known my father for 30 years. I expected maybe some old furniture, a few boxes of tools, something small to remember him by. I did not expect him to slide a folder across the table and tell me my father had left me the entire estate, the house, the remaining shares of the business he'd sold 2 years earlier, the investment accounts, all of it. Once everything settled and the taxes were handled, he said the number quietly, like he was handing me a live wire. Just over $9 million. I remember the room went completely silent, except for a clock ticking somewhere behind me. I asked him to repeat it twice, not because I didn't hear him, but because my brain refused to accept it the first time. He told me there was a letter too, handwritten, sealed, just for me. I didn't open it in that office. I folded it into my jacket pocket and drove home in silence, both hands on the wheel like the car might tip over if I wasn't careful. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I made a decision that would shape everything that came after it. I was not going to tell anyone, not my ex-wife, not my friends at the hardware store, and especially not my daughter, who was 3 months away from her wedding day. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time to think clearly before money changed how anyone looked at me. I had no idea yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. My daughter had been dating a man for almost 2 years by the time my father passed. He was 29, worked in what he called business development, which as far as I could tell meant he sold something to somebody, but never explained exactly what. Polished. Good haircut, good handshake, always complimenting my truck or my garage or whatever was nearby. The kind of charm that works great in a 5-minute conversation and starts feeling thin after an hour. My daughter was head over heels, and I wanted to be happy for her. I really did try, but there was something about the way he asked questions that never sat right with me. Early on, before I even knew about the inheritance, he asked me once, almost casually over a beer on my back porch, whether my father and I were close, whether I ever talked about family money. I remember laughing it off at the time, telling him my father and I barely spoke. He nodded slowly and changed the subject, but I noticed he asked it again in a different way about a month later, wrapped inside a question about her college fund. When they got engaged that spring, right around the time my father's estate was still being finalized, he started showing up to family dinners with little comments about setting up their future the right way and protecting what mattered. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a young man planning a wedding just naturally thinks about money and stability. But some quiet part of me had already started paying closer attention, and once you start noticing a pattern, you can't stop seeing it. Wedding planning turned into its own kind of pressure cooker that summer. He wanted a venue out at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place that charges more for one Saturday evening than most people make in 2 months. My daughter kept apologizing to me about the cost, telling me they'd find a way to make it work on their own. And every time she said that, something in my chest twisted a little tighter. I had $9 million sitting quietly in an account, and my daughter was doing math on a napkin trying to figure out how to afford flowers. I ended up quietly covering a good portion of the wedding costs myself, wiring money to the venue and the caterer directly, telling her it came from savings and a small life insurance payout from her grandfather. That part wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth. He, for his part, seemed very interested in exactly how the payments were being made. He asked her more than once who was handling the deposits and whether her dad had come into some money recently, phrasing it like a joke, but his eyes weren't joking when he said it. She brushed it off every time, telling him I was just a generous father who'd been saving for this day her whole life. I let her believe that story too, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to open. Looking back now, I can see clearly how careful he was being, laying groundwork, asking questions in a way that always sounded harmless on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking a nervous groom. I was wrong about that, and I would find out exactly how wrong soon enough. The wedding day itself was, if I'm being completely completely honest, beautiful. My daughter looked exactly like her mother did on our own wedding day 30 years earlier. And for a few hours that afternoon, I let myself just be a proud father instead of a man sitting on a secret the size of a small fortune. The vineyard looked incredible in the September light, string lights strung between the trees, everyone dressed up and laughing. His mother, a sharp woman with a habit of complimenting people in a way that also sounded like an insult, cornered me near the bar at one point and said out of nowhere, "It's such a relief she has a father who can help them get started right." I smiled and said something forgettable, but I remember the exact way she watched my face after she said it, like she was checking for a reaction. During the toast, he stood up with a glass of champagne and talked about building a secure future together and making smart decisions as a family, which struck me as an odd thing to say at a wedding, instead of talking about love or partnership. A few people laughed politely. My daughter looked happy and a little embarrassed, the way brides do when a speech gets slightly awkward. I clapped along with everyone else, but underneath the applause I felt that same cold, quiet feeling I'd had on the back porch months earlier. Something about his focus on money, even here, even today, told me this wasn't nervous excitement. This was a man who had already been thinking hard about numbers he didn't officially know existed yet. I danced with my daughter. I hugged her tight. I told her I loved her and that I was proud of her, and every word of that was completely true. But driving home that night alone in my truck, I knew something was coming, even if I couldn't yet say exactly what. The honeymoon lasted 10 days, a trip to the coast that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, again, dressed up as money I'd been putting aside. When they got back, something shifted. He started calling me. Not my daughter, me directly, which he had never really done before. He'd ask if I wanted to grab lunch or if I needed help around the house, offering to fix a gutter or look at my truck's transmission, things he had zero background in and even less interest in before the wedding. At first, I told myself this was just a son-in-law trying to build a relationship, and I wanted to believe that because some part of me still wanted him to be a good man for my daughter's sake. But the calls kept coming, always friendly, always casual, and always eventually circling toward a version of the same question. How was I doing financially since retirement? Did I have a good system for managing my accounts? Had I ever thought about consolidating things so they were easier to track as I got older? He said all of this with a smile in his voice, the way you'd ask someone about their garden or their golf game. But I had spent 30 years teaching teenagers, and you learn fast how to spot a kid who's buttering you up before asking for something bigger. He was doing the exact same thing, just with better grammar and a wedding ring. One Sunday afternoon, he showed up unannounced with a six-pack of the beer I liked, sat on my porch for 2 hours, and steered the conversation no less than 4 times toward protecting assets for the family. I nodded along and gave him nothing. But that night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same table where I'd decided to keep my secret, and I admitted something to myself. My son-in-law knew. I needed to know how much he actually knew and how he'd found it out. So I called an old friend of mine, a man I'd taught alongside for 20 years before he left the classroom to do private investigation work on the side, mostly background checks for small businesses. I told him the whole situation over coffee, laid it out plainly. My father, the will, the 9 million, the strange questions creeping in earlier and earlier. He didn't look surprised. He told me probate records are public in Pennsylvania, meaning anyone with a little patience and an internet connection can search county court websites and find out exactly what an estate was worth and who inherited it. It took him 15 minutes at his own kitchen table to pull up my father's filing and confirm the number himself, just to show me how easy it was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop. He asked when my son-in-law had proposed to my daughter. I told him, and he pulled up the date my father's estate had been filed with the county, cross-referenced against local obituary listings. My father died in March. The filing became public record in early April. He proposed the second week of April. My friend looked at me across that coffee shop table and said quietly, "I think you need to ask yourself if this was ever really about your daughter." I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it could be a coincidence, that plenty of young men proposed in springtime, that I was building a conspiracy out of timing and a few too many questions on a porch. But some part of me, the part that had spent months noticing every small thing, already knew he was right, and I needed real proof before I said a single word to anyone. He offered to dig deeper, and I said yes before I even finished thinking it through, because at that point, I needed to know the truth more than I needed to protect my own comfort. It took my friend about 2 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable, it was almost textbook. My son-in-law had been engaged once before, 4 years earlier, to a woman whose family owned a chain of dry cleaning stores across 3 counties. That engagement had ended 8 months in, right around the time her father sold the business, and the money didn't flow the way he apparently expected it to. There was no lawsuit, no public drama, just a quiet breakup that her old college roommate tracked down through a mutual contact, described as him losing interest the second the money situation changed. My friend also found a pattern in his job history: 3 different sales positions in 5 years, each one ending not long after he'd built relationships with wealthier clients, and then apparently tried to insert himself into their personal financial decisions. Once even getting an older client to add him as an authorized user on a business account before getting fired for it. None of it was criminal exactly, nothing that would hold up cleanly in a courtroom, but all of it painted the same picture over and over. A man who who found financial opportunity in relationships and moved quickly once he sensed real money nearby. I sat with that file in my hands for a long time in my garage that night. The same garage where I used to feel closest to being useful, and I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with my father's money and everything to do with my daughter's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was preparing. I decided not to say anything to my daughter right away because I needed to see exactly how far he was willing to go, and because some small stubborn part of me hoped I was wrong. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you're waiting for someone to prove you right about something you desperately don't want to be true. I kept working in the garage most evenings that week, sanding down an old dresser I'd been meaning to finish for months because it gave my hands something to do, while my mind kept circling the same file, the same dates, the same quiet breakup 4 years earlier that nobody had ever turned into gossip. I thought about calling my daughter more than once. I'd pick up the phone, start dialing, then set it back down. What was I going to say? That I'd hired someone to dig into her husband's past because a proposal came 2 weeks after a public filing? It would sound insane coming from a father who'd been hiding $9 million from her for months. I knew that. It's part of why I didn't move faster. I needed something undeniable, not a theory built out of timing and a few uncomfortable conversations on my porch. So I waited, and I watched, and I let him keep circling, because every time he circled, he handed me one more small piece I could set down next to the others. About 3 weeks after the honeymoon, he called and said he wanted to stop by with something important. Just paperwork stuff. Nothing big, he said in that same easy tone he used for everything. I told him to come Saturday morning. When Saturday came, he pulled into my driveway with a folder under his arm and a woman I didn't recognize walking beside him. "This is a notary," he said. "She works with my company sometimes." My stomach dropped the second I saw her lanyard. He sat at my kitchen table, the very same table, and slid the folder toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He explained it as a family protection plan, something his financial advisor had recommended, a document that would let him serve as a secondary authorized contact on certain accounts in case anything ever happened to me, framed entirely around love and caution and taking care of an aging father-in-law. He even brought up my father's sudden death as an example, said it so gently, like he was worried about me, like this whole thing was born out of concern. The notary sat quietly at the end of the table with her stamp and her folder, waiting for a signature that would have handed my son-in-law legal reach into money he wasn't even supposed to know existed. I looked at that folder for a long moment. Then I looked up at him and asked him calmly if he wanted to know how I found out about his first engagement. His face changed instantly, the polish cracking right off him in real time. He asked what I was talking about, but his voice had lost that easy, practiced smoothness, and something tighter and more nervous took its place. I told him plainly. No yelling, no dramatics, just facts laid out one after another, the way I used to explain a math problem to a slow student. I told him about the probate filing timeline, about the engagement that ended right when her family's business sold, about the job history my friend had pulled together, about the authorized user situation that got him fired. I told him I knew about his questions on my porch, his phone calls about consolidating accounts, every single breadcrumb he thought he'd scattered so carefully over the past several months. And I told him I knew he'd proposed 2 weeks after my father's estate became public record. The notary sat frozen at the end of the table, clearly realizing this was not the routine signing she'd been called in for. He tried to recover, said I was misunderstanding everything, that this was purely about family security, that any reasonable person plans ahead. I let him talk for almost a full minute without interrupting, because I wanted him to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually being said out loud instead of dressed up in a soft, caring voice on my back porch. When he finally stopped, I slid the folder back across the table toward him, closed, unsigned, and told him I wasn't going to be signing anything that day or any day after it. Then I told him my daughter was going to hear every single word of this from me before the end of that week. The notary left almost immediately, gathering her folder and her stamp without a word, clearly wanting no part of whatever this had become. He stayed a few minutes longer, alternating between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was making a mistake, that my daughter would never believe any of this coming from me because it would sound like a jealous father trying to control her life. That part actually worried me a little. He wasn't entirely wrong about how it might look on the surface, so instead of just telling her my version of the story, I decided to show her the actual proof, the timeline, my friend's research, and something I hadn't mentioned to him yet, a recording I'd quietly started the moment the notary walked through my door, my phone tucked into my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me I needed more than my word alone. I called my daughter that same afternoon and asked her to come by without him. She showed up 2 hours later looking nervous, asking immediately if I was sick. I told her no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told her months ago. I sat her down at that same kitchen table and told her everything, starting with my father's death and ending with the notary who had been sitting in that exact chair 3 hours earlier. She went through the 9 million first, her face moving from shock to something close to hurt, asking quietly why I hadn't told her sooner. Then I moved to him, and that's when her whole posture shifted. I laid the timeline in front of her. I played her a short piece of the recording, just enough for her to hear his voice explaining the family protection plan to a notary he'd brought without asking me first. She didn't cry right away. She just sat sat there very quietly for almost a full minute, staring at the folder he'd left on my counter, the one I still hadn't signed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way that surprised me. He asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will. I hadn't known that detail. It confirmed everything. She thanked me quietly for telling her, then asked for the folder and the recording, and said she needed to go home and talk to her husband herself that night, alone. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. When she finally called, her voice sounded exhausted but clear. He'd denied everything at first, then shifted to blaming me, calling me manipulative for hiding the inheritance in the first place. She told him plainly that hiding money from a daughter and secretly researching a father-in-law's net worth before proposing were not the same thing, and he didn't have a good answer for that. By the end of the conversation, she told him she needed space, packed a bag, and drove to a friend's apartment. 3 weeks later, she filed for an annulment. Given how quickly things had unraveled and the clear evidence of what he'd been after before the marriage even happened, her lawyer said it was a cleaner path than a lengthy divorce. He didn't fight it much once he understood the recording, and the report existed as documented evidence. I finally sat down properly with my daughter a few weeks after that. No folders, no recordings, just the two of us at my kitchen table, and told her the rest of it. About my father, about the years of distance between us, about wanting to set some of the money aside for her properly this time, done right, with a lawyer. She cried a little, not out of sadness, but something closer to relief, and told me she cared less about the money than about the fact that I'd been quietly protecting her the whole time. She's back in school part-time now, studying something she'd wanted to for years. I still have that folder. It's in the bottom drawer of my kitchen table, unsigned, right where I left it.